The London and Middlesex Archaeological Society holds talks on London's past every month. Check out our event listings on the website at www.lamas.org.uk.
Firstly, can you hear me all at the back okay? Good? Excellent. Well, I'm Tom, as Harvey said, and I work for the City of London as a conservation officer, but I'm also an author. And I became interested in historic lighthouses a few years ago as quite interesting sort of examples of peripheral historic buildings that are more seen in the mind's eye than in the flesh by most of us who don't live on the coasts. And I started researching them, and this led into a book which I'm publishing next year about the rock towers, which are the ones on the right. This is the Bishop Rock Lighthouse here. But I wanted to talk to you about the links between lighthouses and London, which I thought were quite interesting and are actually more substantial than you might at first think. So there is an experimental lighthouse in London, the Blackwall experimental lighthouse, which was built in 1866. And it's built on a site called Trinity Wharf, which for nearly 200 years was a centre of lighthouse manufacturing, of communications and of training. So there actually is quite an enduring connection that London has with the lighthouse network in England. So that's what this talk is intended to deliver, an understanding of that, and also the general context of lighthouses in Britain past and present. So although it seems like a niche subject, there are actually over 150 lighthouses around Britain and Ireland, ranging in all sorts of sizes and shapes, from small 2-storey towers to majestic 10-storey offshore rock towers. So they represent quite an interesting field of research and fruitful exploration. The map on the right there, I know you probably can't read the actual text, but I put it there to give you an indication of how thickly studied our coasts are with lighthouses, particularly along former trade routes, historic trade routes. An example would be the northeast coast, the coal trade and the herring trade there. Lighthouses springing up from the 15th century onwards to safeguard shipping in those vital economic trades. Particularly if you look at the West Irish coast, which is very sparsely populated with lighthouse by comparison, you can see that actually these were responses to economic activity, and that's a key thing to keep in mind as we go through today's talk. The general history of them is, lighthouses that is that up until the 16th century you had quite sort of locally driven informal beacons kept to the initiatives of the local communities on various parts of the coastline. And these were usually kept in adapted buildings rather than purpose-built structures like church towers, monastic architecture, or any kind of prominent stone fortification on the coastline. After the 16th century, when you have official lighthouse bodies starting to emerge, you get a more formal establishment of stations around the coast of England under the auspices of a national system. So up until the 19th century, when things start to really become crystallised as a national lighthouse network, up until then it's very ad hoc and also part private, which I'll come on to in a moment. But today, the historic lighthouses of Britain are maintained by 3 lighthouse authorities: Trinity House, which was founded in 1514, and is the oldest and premier kind of lighthouse authority of them all, and it covers England, Wales and the Channel Islands. And then a few hundred years later you have the Northern Lighthouse Board for Scotland and the Commissioners of Irish Lights for Ireland. And I'll explain why these came along a little later in a moment. We should probably begin at the very beginning with the Alexandra Pharos, which I'm sure many of you will know far more about than I do, but just a quick recap. Built in the 3rd century BC under the Ptolemaic kingdom, it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's quite a famous lighthouse, and certainly the earliest lighthouse we have actual records of. This reconstruction on the left shows it to be a staged tower, standing very, very high indeed. At the time, it was thought to be the tallest roof structure in the locality. It stood for a long time, actually, as well, up until the 15th century, when it was finally demolished by, I think, Arab settlers. But it was quite well represented in antiquity. You can see there's coinage evidence and the evidence of early medieval Arab texts. And actually there are quite consistent accounts of its appearance by Arab scholars who visited. how far it actually influenced lighthouse design in the long term is debatable. Certainly Roman lighthouses, like the Dover Pharos, have a sort of staged profile, diminishing gradually as they rise to the top, to the fire platform. This is obviously, many of you will probably know, our oldest lighthouse in Britain. It was erected in the 1st century AD. We can't be precisely sure of the date, but quite soon after the Claudian invasion of AD 43. And it was originally one of a pair that stood on the eastern and western hills above Dover. The western one today remains only as a sort of fragmentary remains in the bowels of the Victorian fort. But the eastern one, which is pictured, still stands quite high and is quite a good survival, although it is much altered. So it's octagonal in plan, diminishing in stages, as you can see. And the top there was altered in the medieval period to form a bell tower for an adjacent church. However, it would probably, in all likelihood, have had a fire platform, probably made of stone at the top, for an open fire to be displayed as a navigational aid. Most likely as well kept either by a slave or by a kind of specific lighthouse keeper appointed for the purpose. And the towers, were an indication of the value the Romans placed on this port, Portus Dubris, because it was the home port of the naval fleet in Britain in Roman times. And then there was this interesting little idea of a possible lighthouse at Shadwell in London, which is where our London connection begins. And so in the 1970s, there was an excavation in Shadwell that discovered a remains of a square masonry structure, square in plan that is, that was at the time interpreted as a signal tower or pharos by its excavators, on the basis that it occupied a prominent position on the north bank as you come around the bend of the Thames there, that is slightly elevated ground, about 45 feet, I think, above sea level from memory. And this view held for a while, and then recent reappraisal has actually suggested, well, this is more like a funerary monument based on what we now know, even though there weren't very many burials found in the vicinity. So I wanted to give you this just to indicate how there might be problems of interpretation with early lighthouses and the archaeological remains. After all, the fire is elevated and leaves no traces on the ground. So after the Roman administration departs from Britain in AD 410 officially, it may have lingered a bit later, as you probably know, it is a dark age in the historical sense, but also in the lighthouse historical sense. Few lights are known from this time around the coast of Britain up until the early Norman period. But I did want to mention this one quite famous shipwreck, which may have concentrated minds in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this was the wreck of a royal vessel called the White Ship, and it involved the loss or the death of the son and heir of Henry I, who had recently just concluded peace with France and was sailing home to England. The ship struck a submerged rock off the Normandy coast and sank with all hands apart from one survivor, including the son and heir of Henry I. And it kind of emphasised the possible disastrous consequences of shipwreck. And it is quite tempting, for me anyway, to link this with the emergence of lighthouse activity 80 years later in Britain, with some of the early medieval lights. So in Ireland, you have the Hook Lighthouse, which is the oldest working lighthouse in Britain and Ireland today. It was built around 1200 AD on the orders of William Marshall, who was the Earl of Pembroke, a tournament knight, and he held lands in the vicinity. It marks the approach to Waterford Harbour, which was then being developed and emerging as quite a prosperous settlement. And in 1240, we have records of the light here being kept by monks. But I'll come on to monks and light keeping in a moment. As you can see, although it's much altered, it's quite a stocky, kind of muscular, fortress-like building. And it is quite tempting as well to speculate that this was a symbol of Anglo-Norman dominance in Ireland. Much like you might say the Dover Pharos was a symbol of Roman dominance in England, ruling over the night as well as the day. So the other early example here is the western tower of an oratory built on the Isle of Wight. As you can see, this is octagonal in plan, although its perpendicular walls do not diminish in stages. And the little holes, little apertures at the top is where the light would have been shown from. And this has quite an interesting past, this tower. So allegedly, it was built in 1320 AD by a local squire called Walter de Godeston, who was ordered to do it as penance for receiving the goods of shipwreck. There was a ship bound from Picardy in France carrying monastic wine to Britain, and it was wrecked on the shore nearby. And the crew managed to escape unharmed, and the cargo floated ashore. So they tried to make a quick buck by selling it to the islanders. But the owners of the wine, who were at Picardy Monastery, took legal action against the islanders and singled out Walter de Godeston for specific punishment. And because they pleaded in a Roman court, and because the owners of the cargo were a monastery, de Godeston was also faced with excommunication from the faith. So he was ordered to do this as penance for his receiving plunder. And nothing more, sadly, is really known of him. It escapes me when the rest of the oratory was demolished, but we have this survival, which is quite unique. Anyway, I should say that early purpose-built lighthouse towers were the exception rather than the norm because, well, for various reasons, it's expensive to build stone structures, and you need quite concentrated organisation resources and willpower to do so. So more frequently, they seem to have been housed in existing buildings, church towers, monastic architecture, possibly fortresses or castles that were conveniently situated on the coast of England. A good example here, which we can be reasonably sure happened, was Teignmouth Priory. In the early 13th century, a new presbytery was added to the complex with 2 turrets, one of which was said to hold a brazier with an open fire burning as a aid to navigation. And if you think about it, monks would have made very good keepers of lights if they were coal fires or wood fires that had to burn all night, because their monastic schedule of prayers, the complete, I think I pronounced that correctly, meant they had to get up virtually every 3 hours to say the various stages of prayer. So they would have been constantly awake throughout the night and could hence keep the fire burning. That's just a theory of mine, but it seems to make sense. Obviously, after the dissolution, things changed, and in the 16th century, an actual purpose-built lighthouse succeeded the monastic light at Teignmouth, followed by several later buildings. So you have this kind of local initiative, ad hoc arrangement, lights slowly emerging around the coast of England through the medieval period up to the 16th and 17th, early 17th centuries, when things suddenly accelerate. And one of the reasons is the emergence of Trinity House as the sort of main body appointed by the Crown for looking after sea marks, lighthouses, and the safety of mariners. Now, initially, it was incorporated in 1514. It was, in all likelihood, a much earlier medieval guild of Thames mariners. Again, the London connection with lighthouses, these people were Thames mariners, and they were headquartered at first in Deptford. And their initial responsibility was for charitable works and the welfare of seafarers. Specifically, lighthouses were not included until 1566, when Elizabeth I granted them the power to build and maintain lighthouses and sea marks. And their actual charter today dates from 1685. They have a London connection and always have had as Thames mariners. Their headquarters have been variously at Deptford, at Water Lane in the city, and from 1796 at Tower Hill in London, in their building designed by Samuel Wyatt. Very elegant classical building. And the picture at the top shows kind of various personnel at Trinity House. You have a gang of sort of ship captains and mariners in their sort of 18th century breeches. You have Winston Churchill in his dress as master. He was master temporarily. And the current incumbent, who is master, on the right. But they were quite slow to start building lighthouses for some reason, possibly because of the expense, and possibly because they were mariners who were not builders. You know, they were concerned with seafaring in real time, as it were. The first tower they built is this one, Lowestoft in Suffolk, 1609. It went through many iterations during its life as technology developed. New ways of showing the lights came into being, and the structures had to be adapted as a result. It's quite a good example, actually, of coastal lighthouses in Britain. Many of them have the same general appearance, which is the main light tower, circular on plan, with ancillary buildings next to it, and these would have housed storerooms, engine rooms, and of course keepers' accommodation. And they were often designed in this quite plain, almost cottage ornate style, with classical flourishes here and there, and whitewashed. And if you remove the tower, this could be almost anywhere, the buildings. The current complex, as I say, dates from the 1870s. And this tower at the Lizard in Cornwall, which is the first landfall you would see if you were coming across the Atlantic towards the Channel, makes the point about the state of the lighthouse network in the 17th century. So it was not just Trinity House who had the ability to build and maintain sea marks and lighthouses. Private speculators could also do this as money-making enterprises. And what few people know about the lighthouse network and lighthouse history is that in the early days of a formal system, it was actually part privatised, and lighthouses were built as speculations from which money and vast profits were expected, with the consequential squeezing of keepers' wages and fuel costs, which is quite an interesting idea, much like our railway network. And profit came first. So this one was proposed initially by Sir John Killigrew, who came ironically from a family of notorious smugglers and pirates. I think he was trying to turn over a new leaf or something. Anyway, he sought a patent from the monarch and was granted one, built his lighthouse in 1620, but he had great difficulty in actually securing any money from ships passing it. So the way that these things were profitable and the way that the lighthouse system is financed today is that ships passing the light pay what's called a light due. It's like a tax or a toll, which is collected by agents of the owner or organisation at the harbour they dock at. So it's relatively straightforward. But in this early day, these were the early days of formal lighthouse building, and I think he found it very difficult to make it work. Whatever the reason, in 1624 the light was extinguished, and then there were a series of several inconsequential proposals to do something more. And it wasn't until 1748 that the architect of the present buildings, which you can see on the right, Thomas Fonereau, who was a Frenchman, successfully sought a patent from the king via Trinity House, who by this stage had realised that if they secured the patent from the king and then leased the building sites to private individuals who would meet the risk and the cost of building lighthouses, they could have absolved themselves of the risk while still playing a part in the creation of the system. So that's what happened in this case. The part private and part, if you like, public nature of the network continued uneasily for some years, until mounting outrage at the kind of obscene profits that were being made from these things demanded action. From the 1750s onwards, shipping in British waters increased exponentially and began to pay huge amounts of profits to lighthouse owners, and particularly on profitable trade routes. This example here, the Skerries in Anglesey, sits basically on the Liverpool route, the route between Liverpool and England. And as that port's fortunes boomed, so did the fortunes of the owners of this lighthouse. And you can see the brief potted history there. Early rejected proposals in 1658 and 1705, first light 1717, 1759 rebuilt. It's a very typical catalogue of development of coastal lighthouses. They go through several iterations, as I mentioned earlier. In 1836, Trinity House was given the permission, or the right, to buy out compulsorily all the private owners and try to establish some kind of national network that was scandal-free. And finished doing this by 1841 with the purchase of the Skerries from its owners for the staggering sum of £444,984, which is millions and millions of pounds in today's money, and quite an obscene sum. But what it does show you is how much money that lighthouse is making annually. That figure is calculated on its annual revenues. It's quite extraordinary. And I would also say that the lighthouse you can see in the picture, is again a very typical, quite interesting example of how you have the tower on a coastal site and the kind of buildings growing from it in various organic ways, probably reflecting its development from the 17th century onwards. So just a brief diversion to Scotland and Ireland. Things developed a little later. in those countries simply due to the fluctuations of trade. And by the 18th century, trade was booming in both countries, or around the coast, parts of the coasts of both countries, I should say, to be accurate. And consequently, there was greater need for lighthouses, greater noise about the requirements for them, and finally something was done. So in 1786, Acts of Parliament were passed to create equivalents to Trinity House in Scotland and Ireland. So you have the Commissioners for Northern Lights in Scotland and the Commissioners for Irish Lights in Ireland, who started life under a few other names, but eventually assumed their present form in 1876. I show you these images here of Georgian, Edinburgh and Dublin, because these, unlike Trinity House, who were quite clannish and medieval in origin, these organisations were more Georgian and clubbable in character, they were ship owners and businessmen, they were consortiums of like-minded people who were interested in business and in seafaring, but weren't necessarily all seafarers themselves. So it's important to bear that in mind, I think. And finally, well, not finally, but I wanted to also just briefly mention some of the engineers of lighthouses, because these were a special breed themselves. And as lighthouses became a more formal and substantial national network, so the skill and specialism of their engineers increased, shrinking the pool of kind of ad hoc building contractors and so on into a small pool of very specialised engineers with quite specific talents at erecting these things. Granted, coastal lighthouses are like any other building in many ways. They're brick built, they're slate roofed, and anybody can build them. There's nothing different about them to any other building. But the offshore towers, which are the real kind of masterpieces of lighthouse building, as we're going to see, could only be built by very specific people, three of whom are here. So on the left you have Robert Stevenson, who was the founder of the Stevenson dynasty of lighthouse engineers, extremely capable and productive group of people who were all engineers to the Commissioners for Northern Lights in Scotland. Nearly all Scottish lighthouses are built by this one family over a period of about 200 years, beginning with this man. And he was apprenticed to a tinsmith initially as a young man called Thomas Smith. And Thomas Smith was the first engineer to the Commissioners for Northern Lights. But also, as a sideline, he lit most of Edinburgh New Town when it was being laid out in the late 18th century. So you had a kind of link there between street lighting and coastal lighting, if you like. But Stevenson was his apprentice, went on to become a largely self-taught engineer who became the engineer to the Northern Lighthouse, Commissioners for Northern Lights. His masterpiece is probably the Bellrock Lighthouse, which I'm going to show you in a moment, but a very capable guy. The last sort of part of his dynasty with involvement in lighthouse building was none other than Robert Louis Stevenson, the author, who, after a brief foray into lighthouse building, decided to flee that arduous business for the much cushier life of a writer. I've gone in the opposite direction myself. So the next guy on the slide is John Smeaton, who comes a little earlier than Robert Stevenson. You'll probably be aware of who he is. Often thought of as the first civil engineer in the sense that he brought together certain strands of disciplines and practiced them all at once, and was responsible for a great many what we would call today civil engineering projects, bridges, harbours, that kind of thing. But he was the man who built what we would call the first masonry rock lighthouse off the coast of Devon, the third Eddystone lighthouse, and in doing so he created the blueprint for all subsequent lighthouse towers. So he's very important, and you shall see why as we go through the lecture. And finally, you have on the right an example of the sort of hard-bitten Victorian tough guy who ended up building a lot of the offshore stations, Sir James Douglas, who was a fairly formidable character who actually encapsulates the title of this talk rather well. So he was born in Bow in East London in the 1820s and began his career as an apprentice to his father at Trinity House's Blackwall engineering workshops on the wharf that I showed you earlier. He was then tasked with building the first Bishop Rock lighthouse, southwest of the Scilly Isles. So he made the journey from Blackwall to the Bishop Rock in the 1860s, and it's probably due to him that I came up with the title today. So I've just been talking about rock lighthouses. Unlike the coastal lighthouses, these are things that cannot be, that don't really bear much resemblance to anything on land. It's best to think of them as being entirely shaped by their context, which of course is extremely tough, very wave-swept. Enormous pressures these buildings have to withstand is quite extraordinary. And as such, I see them as a group. There are 19 of them still standing in the British and Irish waters. And I see them as a kind of unique group of very, very specialised, but almost perfect, flawless kind of building. Because in situations like these, you can't be anything other than perfect and flawless, or at least well designed. So, the first one on the left was the first Eddystone lighthouse. This Eddystone rock plays a big part in the lighthouse story, which you will hopefully see as the talk progresses. It was designed, you can see it's quite an extraordinary thing to encounter out at sea. It's got a sort of Rococo type air about it, with lots of unnecessary decoration, which perfectly sort of sheds light onto the character of its builder, who was a guy called Henry Winstanley, who started life as an architect to Orleans Palace in the royal household in Essex. He was an Essex man himself, but he later developed a bizarre sideline for inventing things, including a pack of playing cards and a museum which had robots in it. So, yeah, quite strange. But he somehow managed to build this on the Eddystone Reef, which is 13 miles out to sea, pounded by the waves in winter, extremely unpromising building site, and I'll talk about construction a bit later. But he did it, and it stood from 1698 to 1703, when it was blown away in the great storm of that year, with Winstanley himself inside it, which is rather fitting, if tragic. Several others followed, which I'll go into in a moment, but the last tower that we have, the last example of the masonry rock lighthouse, is the second Fastnet lighthouse off the coast there, which was finished in 1904. And if you look at the two, I hope the differences are fairly evident. I mean, the one is a sort of fanciful, experimental type thing that looks far too flimsy for its location, whereas the other almost grows from the rock as a kind of forced growth, if you like. Exquisitely detailed. I've spent 5 nights in this tower earlier this month, and I can say from experience, it's exquisitely detailed and is in perfect condition despite over 100 years of assault by the waves. So, other early examples of rock lighthouses are bizarre, and they sort of reflect the experimental solutions that were trying to be devised early on to solve the problem of these building sites. And the semi-submerged or mostly submerged reef represents, very real difficulties in building design and construction, which were overcome only after a series of experiments, failed attempts, etc. But what is surprising, actually, is how few of these attempts failed, and how many of them actually endured despite their ridiculous-looking character. For instance, the Smalls Lighthouse of 1776 on the left looked so spindly it wouldn't last 5 minutes in a strong gale, let alone a hurricane. But actually, this endured until the 1850s, when it was replaced by a masonry tower. The principle of this tower, this lighthouse, is that the stilts mean the water passes through the legs rather than spending its force, rather than gathering enough force to take the whole thing with it. And it worked. It was, strangely enough, it was designed and built by a maker of musical instruments called Henry Whiteside, about whom nothing else is known, quite nicely. And quite interestingly as well, which I'll come on to in a moment, is that, if you like, a kind of archaeology of this tower survives out there on the reef in the form of the stumps of its fixings to the rock, which is you wouldn't expect archaeology in a place like this, maybe, but there it is. The picture on the right is the second Eddystone lighthouse that replaced that earlier one I showed you in the last slide. And unlike that quite fanciful creation, this is a sort of severe conical wooden tower built of ship's planks, designed to flex with the action of the waves rather than stand firm against them, so deal with the problem that way. And this again was successful. It lasted from 1709 until the 1750s, when it fell prey to its obvious weakness, fire, and burned to the ground, or burned to the sea, I should say. But again, this was designed by a sort of odd-sounding character called John Rudgett, who was a silk merchant of Ludgate Hill, and nothing much is known about him either. These, if you like, amateurs indicate the kind of private enterprise that I was talking about earlier, where you had people who took upon it on themselves to try and do these extraordinary projects in return for vast profits and prestige. And it worked in some cases. The last picture on the right there is a more conventional short stone tower that was placed on the Longships Reef, which is southwest of Land's End, by Samuel Wyatt, the guy who also designed Trinity House's headquarters that we saw earlier. And this lasted for a good long time until it was replaced by a taller tower. But the breakthrough and the kind of crystallization of the approach really comes with John Smeaton's Eddystone Lighthouse of 1759. And it was designed on two principles, an oak tree and a curbstone. So Smeaton took his inspiration from things he saw around him, and quite simple, natural things. And one morning when he was walking outside his Holborn offices, he chanced to see a row of curbstones that had been freshly laid in the street, and they had been dovetailed together, like you would see in woodworking more commonly at that time. And he realised that actually this technique of dovetailing could be used with masonry far more ambitiously than it hitherto had been. And so he came up with the idea of building this Eddystone lighthouse entirely out of interlocking pieces of masonry. So instead of just laying the blocks side by side and mortaring them together, these actually fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And in doing so, they formed an unbreakable stone mass which could only be dismantled in the reverse order to that in which it had been assembled, giving it a kind of mighty strength that completely withstood the force of the sea very well. It stood there on this reef for 123 years. The other principle he used, that of the oak, was simply to gather the centre of gravity of the tower deep into its belly, deep down as low as it possibly could go, like the thick tree trunk of an oak, on the grounds that this would give it as great a resistance to these forces as possible, and his approach worked. You can see the sort of tapering silhouette of the tower on the right was his attempt to mimic that oak tree form, and the central picture shows you the very complicated system of dovetailing, which also required masons of sufficient patience and skill to carve these things out of granite, which was the only building stone durable enough to use in a site as exposed as this. The tower, as I said, stood for nearly 123 years and was only taken down when it was found that the rock itself on which the tower stood was being undermined by the sea, rather than any weakness in the tower itself, which shows how well it had been built. And it was re-erected on Plymouth Hoe as a monument to its creator, which is quite nice, and it's still there today. So it also has the dubious distinction of having travelled back to the land, as well as out to sea. It influenced the rest of the towers that came along. As I said, there are 19 of them still standing in British waters. These are just a few, and you can see they all share its tapering silhouette, its dovetailed granite construction, well, apart from the Needles lighthouse in the middle there, which is perpendicular. But the Needles stands in calmer seas than the Atlantic, which was what the Eddystone was designed to resist, and the others actually. So the Wolf Rock and the Bishop Rock to the right, both stand in Cornish seas off the coast of Cornwall, extremely exposed sites, and are still there. And they are Victorian works which took Smeaton's prototype, if you like, and refined it and enhanced it into something truly majestic, especially in the case of the Bishop Rock, which stands so isolated, about 2.5 hours sailing from the Scilly Isles themselves. The tower on the left is Robert Stevenson's Bell Rock that I mentioned earlier, of 1811, and quite interestingly, this tower had a completely wood-panelled bookcase, room at the top of it, library with exquisite oak joinery inside, furnishings, bookcases with copies of the Bible and other moralising works, and a beautiful domed ceiling with like sort of plaster imitation of fan vaulting. It sadly was destroyed by fire in the 60s, but it shows that even in exposed offshore sites like this, you could find sort of Georgian flair and elegance, which was quite tantalising, and I'm very sorry it's not there anymore. A word on the construction of these things. The two pictures, I hope, sort of give you a flavour of quite what a feat of engineering this was. On the left, you have the Prince of Wales viewing the blocks of the fourth Eddystone Lighthouse in the quarry, where they reposed before being constructed, assembled out at the reef. And that gives you a good idea of the sort of complexity of the interlocking forms of the masonry, and how by this time, which was the 1880s, the masonry was dovetailing laterally as well as vertically, so not just with its neighbours, but with all of its neighbours above and below. Extremely sophisticated. And the picture on the right shows the Fastnet Lighthouse being assembled in situ, so offshore at its site. These really were prefabricated buildings. It's best to think of them that way. Out on an exposed site like this, your time was very limited. You had to work quickly. You could only build really from May to October, or whenever the weather started to get too rough and you had to stop. And often these places would be miles offshore, and you'd spend nearly 2 hours, 3 hours just reaching them. So what they did was fitted all the blocks together in the sort of yards where they were carved as a dry run. So these buildings were actually erected on land first, in facsimile, if you like, before being dismantled again, shipped out to their sites and re-erected. And very often, at least in the early days, it was a simple block and tackle pulley arrangement that was used to haul these 2 ton and above blocks of granite up to their respective positions. So enormous sort of muscle power, energy that went into these things. From the 1860s onwards, steam power was used. A way was found to have steam engines on ships that were specially designed to facilitate this process. But still, it was no easy feat even then. And just picking up the point I made earlier about rock lighthouse archaeology, it seems very unlikely, doesn't it, that any traces of archaeology would survive in such remote sites. But actually, where towers replaced previous iterations, they do, quite surprisingly. So the stump of Smeaton's Eddystone is still out there on the reef, next to its successor, the 4th lighthouse designed by that man, James Douglas, who I mentioned earlier. And above you have the Fastnet Rock, which is actually a bigger rock than most of them. And you have an extremely interesting 1850s complex of workshops, barracks and storerooms still surviving there, just made of brick and timber and iron, like a lot of terrestrial buildings, but somehow still in situ. Really remarkable place to explore. So you could think of these places as having a slim amount of archaeological potential, which you might not have thought about otherwise. But to return to Blackwall, which is one of the cores of this talk, I wanted to explain a bit about the wharf and how it came into being. So Trinity House in 1803 acquired this space in East London, so it is located at the junction of the River Lee and the River Thames, now opposite the Millennium Dome. And it was a large site which they began to fill up with storehouses and other kinds of very simple industrial buildings, which were used for various purposes, none of which are particularly interesting. But in 1854, they made the decision to adapt one of their storehouses with an experimental lantern, because 20 years earlier, in the 1830s, they had employed Michael Faraday as their chief scientific advisor to find ways of brightening the beams and lights that were being used in their aids to navigation. And Faraday needed somewhere to experiment, so he was given a workshop here and given an experimental lantern here to shine beam lights from across the Thames and all over London, so which must have been quite a surreal sight for Londoners, I think. There's a view there gives you an idea of what the wharf was like in 1868. This was done this drawing was made 2 years after the current experimental lighthouse and chain and buoy store were constructed by James Douglas, who I mentioned earlier, in his then role as chief engineer to Trinity House. And this reflected the need for more and better accommodation on the wharf for Trinity House in the mid-19th century, when their business was really booming as a result of having bought out all of those private lighthouses and needing to build more, and consequently needing more space. There's, on the right, you have a plan of the wharf in 1985, showing a complex of buildings in fairly random locations, but with the experimental lighthouse centre stage in the middle there. And this gives you a bit more detail of what it looks like today. So you have a kind of big industrial building, single story, but with a big pitched roof, which is used for the chain and buoy storage, as I said, with railway tracks running through it. Built of brick and very simply detailed. It's quite a standard building, apart from the extraordinary lighthouse tower on the eastern end, which is polygonal, has polygonal walls, but really is a true octagon mirroring the Dover Pharos. And it is a two-stage tower, as you can see, crowned with an iron lantern that was cast, or was produced in Founders Court, just behind the Bank of England. So, truly a creation of London. But originally it had two towers, two lanterns, not just one. And the picture, I hope you can see it, on the bottom right-hand corner shows its earlier lantern in situ, so one at either end, one at either gable. And this was removed in 1920 for reasons unknown. But when I was looking at this, I realised that it reminded me of something. And actually, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you have a very cute little chapel in Ilfracombe, the Chapel of St. Nicholas, which too has a little lantern, much like this, on one gable wall. It seems like I should probably talk a little bit about lights, given these buildings were there solely to house a light, as well as their keepers in some cases. And I'll rattle through this quite quickly, but essentially early lights were coal-fired or wood-fired, and with all the consequent problems that caused, smoke, ash, that kind of thing, fuel, raised problems of disposal and of regulation, and also of assistance. An unassisted light is not very strong and cannot be seen from a great range. And this was realised as the need for lighthouses strengthened, and various solutions were proposed to it. But you can just see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a tower there in the bottom corner, the Isle of May, which is a coal-fired light with a little basket for hauling the fuel up, a very typical example of its kind. And then you can see the chandelier type thing that Smeaton installed in his Eddystone Lighthouse, which is rather ironic because you have this magnificent stone tower that we looked at earlier, but with just these feeble candles burning in the top of it, smoking up the glass and getting all sorts of mess all over the place. Because the problem with candles, of course, is that as the flames eat the wax, flames disappear slowly, and in some cases below the rim of the lantern, which was no good for the seafarers looking for them. So obviously this situation was not sustainable. And in the 18th century, advances were made in developing a kind of lamp called an argan lamp that burned, it was an oil lamp that burned with a clean, smokeless flame, without the flame descending down the wick. So that was a good start. And these were teamed with what were called parabolic reflectors, which were not quite saucer-shaped silver dishes that took some of the light produced by the oil lamp and reflected it outwards. And you had by 1811, which is when the bell rock was constructed, some quite interesting elaborate arrangements of sort of 3x6 reflectors with oil lamps beaming out quite a strong light over the horizon. So that was successful. But it could be done better even then, and in 1820 a Frenchman called Augustin Fresnel started to experiment with, instead of reflecting the light using metal, refracting it through glass. And the result was the kind of contraption you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which is called a catadioptric lens, which both reflects and refracts, but initially they just refracted. Extraordinarily exquisite and complicated things to produce. What it does is the light source within it, all of the rays that come off this light, concentrated by the glass prisms you can see radiating in circles from the bullseye centre into a single strong beam that can go much further over the horizon than any of the previous solutions could. The Fastnet light here, so this is one of the last ones to be produced, has a range from memory, I think, of 27 nautical miles and has something like 2.5 million candle power behind it. I was really blinded by it actually when I was there, up in the lantern at night time. But it's the complexity of this thing, which weighs 6 tons and turns on a bath of mercury, cannot be overstated. And I think by this time, when you have late 19th, early 20th century systems of glass production and of metalworking, you have lenses and optical arrangements as sophisticated as the masonry towers which house them. So at this time you get this absolute convergence of masonry construction, masonry talented construction, and optical equipment. So these kinds of devices were experimented with at Blackwall by Michael Faraday and his successor, John Tyndall, who was an Irish mountaineer and scientist. And a typical example of the experiments that were done here was the testing of coloured glass for the Wolf Rock Lighthouse, which we saw in an earlier picture. It was in 1869, it was just being finished, and so the thinking moved on to what kind of light it would have in its lantern. And it was decided that it should show a red and white light flashing in alternately sort of equal measure, so one flash red, one flash white. And to find the correct proportion of ruby glass and clear glass, lenses were set up in the lanterns of the experimental lighthouse, and the results were observed from Charlton in south-east London, which is indicated on the map with a blue circle, which is a range of about 2 nautical miles, so quite short given the distances the light was expected to travel, but nevertheless must have presented quite a bizarre spectacle, but especially for the people who lived in this area, these sorts of firework displays almost flashing out over the rooftops of their houses. And it does, I think, make the point as well a little that, you know, at this time London was a centre of manufacturing and of science and of sort of intense commercial activity taking place side by side with residential uses, and we have now lost that, of course, to some extent. The wharf handled other things as well, not just lighthouses. It was also used for the maintenance of buoys and of light vessels, other aids to navigation. And this was actually quite a substantial part of its business. A light vessel actually remains there today, which formerly marked the Goodwin Sands and is now converted into a recording studio. But the pictures here, I hope, give you a flavour of the sorts of things that were done there. The way to think about the wharf, this wharf, Trinity Buoy Wharf, is as a kind of mechanical operation. You know, the lighthouse system required specially made parts that were durable rather than disposable. If you think about it, it's so difficult to reach some of these lighthouses. If anything broke, you needed to be able to repair it, or at least be able to kind of conserve what you had until help came. It wasn't just a matter of putting in a different component and chucking the other one away. And so at the wharf here, you had teams of specialists, craftspeople, you had coppersmiths, you had tinsmiths, you had fitters, and all sorts of people who were extremely capable and talented at making these bespoke fittings, which couldn't be bought anywhere else. That started to change as technology gathered momentum and moved on in the 1970s and 1980s. And I'll come on to the consequences of that in a bit. I should also explain as well that the complex of buildings you see there is mainly 19th century and 20th century. The wharf was damaged in the war and some buildings were rebuilt in the 1950s. It played host to some modernity. It was used in the 1970s to test a new type of alteration that would revolutionise rock lighthouse operation, the helipad for the rock towers that we've just been looking at. And this was an extraordinary achievement at the time, which was to create a steel structure that could be bolted down onto the roof or the top of these granite towers to take a helicopter, and thus making it much easier to relieve the keepers who lived inside them, and also to supply them and to repair them and so on. But in doing this, this ease of access actually hastened the automation of the lighthouse network. The rock lighthouses, first of all, the coastal lighthouses not too long behind, and in doing so, changed the way that they were installed, fitted out, and operated from a mechanical-based system to an electrical one, where you could have disposable components and things that were easily discardable, rather than purpose-built, handmade things by specialists. And the wharf hosting this helipad testing also was the final nail in its coffin in a way, because it closed a few years later. Its specialist craftsmen and bespoke fittings no longer needed in an age where circuitry had replaced gadgetry. So, food for thought. And finally, just to talk a bit about the specific links between Blackwall and the Bishop Rock. We saw them earlier in the persona of Sir James Douglas, the hard-bitten Victorian engineer who grew up in Bow and later built that structure on the left, which was the first Bishop Rock lighthouse, a cast iron structure that was test assembled at Blackwall in the yard before being shipped out there. So it had its first erection in London. The central picture is the existing Bishop Rock lens, which had the same treatment in the Blackwall wharf. Its complex system of lenses and metalwork was tested from the lanterns over Charlton and the surrounding area. And you have that interesting idea that you have these lights which are destined for cruel and violent seas being shone at first over circumstances of almost unnatural placidity and calmness. Quite an interesting idea. The Bishop Rock is there again on the right. And I'll just close by saying that the Blackwall Lighthouse is unusual in the sense that often industrial sites, once their equipment and machinery and so on is removed, you're just left with brick shells that actually don't tell you a great deal. And at the Blackwall Wharf it's different. You have an extraordinary experimental lighthouse surviving, which immediately conveys to you how London once had a very long-lived and substantial connection with the furthest reaches of the kingdom. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this talk, perhaps you'd like to join our society. Our memberships start from £6 a year for students and £20 a year for individuals, and includes a free copy of our transactions publication. See www.lamas.org.uk/join-lamas.html for more details.